Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have a very special guest for today's video, Chelsea Adler, and together we're going to be ranking the Casualty Actuarial Society exams by their difficulty, their interestingness of the content, and the study time required. So Chelsea is a fellow of the Casualty of the Actuarial Society. She's worked for companies like Milliman and State Farm, and she now works at Root Inc. So, Chelsea, if you'd like to give a brief overview about yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Bella, for having me on your channel. I'm so honored to be here. You actually introduced me to this whole ranking concept. So I'm really excited to get to do this. Hopefully this will be really valuable content for the viewers. But yeah, other than my professional history, which you touched on, I am super passionate about the actuarial profession. I just genuinely think it's a fantastic career. And so because of that, I launched a blog a couple years back to just kind of help educate people about what actuaries do, and also try to give back in a way. And so that has just been so life-giving to me. And honestly, I've been blessed in return probably so much more than others have. But that is sort of how we got connected. I also have a YouTube channel and a couple of social media platforms through LinkedIn, Instagram, and now TikTok. So yeah, it's just been really fun to help others learn about this profession that's kind of a mystery to most, and also get to provide resources that help people pursue it if that's something that they are passionate about. So yeah, I'm just honored to be here today.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on. And like Chelsea mentioned, she has her own YouTube channel, which is how I reached out to her. So if you guys are interested, I will link her channel in the description below, and you can also check out the content she has made about actuarial science. So before we get into the actual rankings of the CAS exams, I wanted to ask Chelsea a few questions about her overall exam process. So the first question I have for you is, how long did it take you to complete the exam sequence? And did you start the exams in college, or how many years after college did you start them?
Yeah. So in total, it took me about 7 years. I did start in college when I was a sophomore. So it was about 2.5 years in college, and then about 5-ish years once I was working professionally.
Okay. And how did you find the exam to life balance compared from being in school to work? Which one do you think was easier in terms of having time to study?
Yeah, I mean, both were challenging for different reasons. So in college, I was actually a collegiate athlete. I did synchronized swimming for actually 15 years of my life, but that was kind of uh, another full-time job for me in college. So it was pretty difficult. I had to be very disciplined to study for actuarial exams and take classes and swim. Whereas when I graduated, I only really had my full-time job, but then my husband and I got married shortly after college. And so just the dynamic of wanting to prioritize that relationship and other relationships as we had moved to a new town made it a little trickier to study at the same time. So I think no matter what stage of life you're in, it's always going to be tough. And you just kind of have to decide what matters to you and prioritize your life accordingly.
Yeah, that's some really great advice. How many exams did you take in college and then out of college?
Yeah, so I took 3 in college. So I started with PFM, and then I took what used to be called MFE. And so I had those 3 when I landed my first full-time job, and then I started taking the rest of the exams once I was working full-time.
And how many months on average would you say that it took you to study for each exam?
Yeah, so this was really fun to look back on. I had mentioned to you I needed to kind of refresh my memory because it's been a while since I took these exams. And one really cool thing that I will have for our discussion later on is I actually have all of the exact study hours I put in for each exam just documented from when I started working full time. And so I don't have those for PNFM, but I have a general idea. But I think most of the time it was somewhere between 3 to 5 months. I typically like to be over prepared for things. And so I would try to start really, really early, and just kind of make sure I had extra time just in case, life happens and things come up. But yeah, at a minimum, probably 3 or 4 months for some of the earlier exams and longer for the harder ones down the line. But yeah, it just kind of depended on the season. And I think the most important thing, in my opinion, is after every exam, like I always took a break of at least a month. Like you need a little bit of time to recharge. So that was kind of my general cycle was, exams are roughly every 6 months. So study for three to five, and then take a break.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to hear the specific data that you collected for this. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
And then I don't know if you're comfortable sharing, but have you failed any exams?
Yes, I'm comfortable sharing. And yes, I have failed. And honestly, I think this is so healthy to share because it's so easy for people to assume that when you're struggling or you're going through a hard time, that you're the only one. And that's just truly not the case most of the time. And I mean, I think most people, when they get into the actuarial field or start pursuing it, like you kind of know head knowledge that it's hard and that people work really hard in this profession. Um, and so very few people actually do pass all the exams on the first try, and you don't need to be successful in this career. And that's something that I'm just super passionate about, kind of trying to re-emphasize for people. And so in my specific situation, I had to retake exam 5 when I took it for the first time. And then later on had to retake both 7 and 8. And those are only offered once a year. So that was like a full year of failure for me, which was really, really hard. And honestly, shaped a lot of my kind of personal growth that I've experienced since then. So yes, I try to share about that because, I worked really hard on those exams, but I'm not perfect. But I'm also very fortunate that I kept going and was able to make progress in my career despite those challenges.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I also would like to share that I've taken PNFM and I had to retake both of them once. So I think it is completely normal to have to retake at least one exam. For
Yeah.
me, it was about changing my study habits and being over prepared. So what do you think helped you to pass the later exams on the second try? What was the difference?
Yeah, I think you sort of hit on it, is recognizing, what could you have done differently and better the second time around. So making sure you like learn from your prior experience. Sometimes it's purely just a function of I just didn't have the time to put in. And if that's the case, then it's kind of an easy fix of like just make sure you kind of get closer to that target number of study hours the next time around. For me on exam 5, that was really like it felt like kind of a big shock because I felt really prepared going in. And then during the exam itself, I knew I was not going to pass because I wasn't working quickly enough to even answer all the questions. So I walked out with like maybe a quarter of the questions, like not even answered. And so I was like, okay, clearly I didn't have enough training to approach this exam, efficiently enough to even apply the learning that I had. And so it was clear to me that I needed to personally start timing myself for exams and getting used to working really quickly. That was really not something I'd ever done before. And so that was extremely helpful for me the second time around. And then 7 and 8 were also pretty just kind of jarring when I didn't pass them because again, like I thought going in, I had done everything I could have. And there's probably not a better word to describe actuarial exams than humbling. Like you can sometimes do everything right and still not pass. And it's just important to know that sometimes that can happen. But I took a really critical look at how I had prepared the first time for those 2 exams. And I explored some additional like third-party study materials. Previously, I had really just used a single source for all of my studying. And then I found it's actually called Casual Fellow or Rising Fellow. And I've tried to share about them a lot because they just really had a caliber of exam problems that the other study materials did not. And that was really kind of the edge that I needed to think more deeply and more critically so that when I got to the exam and saw things that I'd never seen before, I just knew how to think about it differently. And so sometimes, yeah, it's just a function of like try something different and see what works.
Wow, thank you for sharing that resource too as well. I'm sure we will need it as we go through our exam progress. Okay, last question before we get into the exam rankings.
Mhm.
As you progressed through the exams, did you find them to become more mathematical or more conceptual based?
Hmm. 100% the latter. I think they do generally start off. I mean, the first few are like computer based, right? Like it's multiple choice,
Mhm.
usually very, very heavy on the computation. And then as you go along, you get into more of the open-ended questions and truly what's more similar to what our jobs actually look like is taking data and then having to make a decision based on that data and justifying your reasoning for it. And so that certainly was a pretty big shift. And I think on the CAS track, for me, it felt like that shift happened around exam 5, which was also part of the reason I likely just wasn't as prepared the first time around. So yeah, it's important to keep in mind, especially for people who love math and get into being an actuary because they love math, is, it's not going to be black and white forever. Our profession is extremely ambiguous. And so you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable and really thinking through that sometimes there's not going to be a right answer. You just have to use data to support whatever you recommend.
Mhm. Awesome. Now we will get into the rankings of the exams. All right. So for the audience, this is a ranking template that I made. So on the bottom, you can see that there's an exam bank of all the exams that Chelsea has taken to earn her FCAS certification. And on the bottom right are some ideas I provided for how Chelsea can rate the exams. And then the categories that they can be ranked into are they were her favorite exam, they were just okay, she never wants to take them again, or they were questioning her life choices. So this is the template, and we'll get started. So Chelsea, whichever exam you would like to start ranking, you can go ahead.
Okay. So I'm actually going to lump both P and FM together because they had a lot of similarities for me. I ranked them both in terms of difficulty as kind of like the lowest caliber. I do think that's intentional, of course, like those are the first exams that people are starting off with. And I think too, I was fortunate to have college classes that helped prepare me for the exams. So to me, I had a little bit of kind of a leg up compared to somebody who was maybe starting to study for these two on their own from scratch. So for me, I felt like difficulty was kind of on the lower end. I found them both very interesting. I had a very positive experience kind of getting into the profession initially because I was like, wow, this is really interesting stuff. And while it's hard, I was able to learn it pretty well. And then these are the only exams that I don't have like exact studied hour numbers, but I do think I was probably pretty close to what they generally recommend, which is the hour per exam hour. So for these, that would be 300 hours. So my guess is with the like class time that I put in and the supplemental studying, it was probably about 300 for each of those. So for right now, I would actually probably put those two up in like the favorite category. I might adjust that as we go, but they're definitely high up there for me to start.
Awesome. Starting off strong. All right, so that was the first two exams. And then I believe you said that MFE is the equivalent of MAS 1.
I can't say with confidence that it is equivalent to
Mhm.
MAS 1. The actual technical name for it at the time was Models in Financial Economics. The few on here, MFE, LC, and ST, those were ones that were pretty short-lived and then they got replaced. So I think roughly those plus C maybe it encompasses Mass 1 and 2 now.
Mhm.
But anyway, this first one was kind of focused on financial economics, as I said before. So I had that one at like moderate difficulty. It definitely was a step up from PNFM. And I didn't find it as interesting personally. Again, I don't have the exact hours for this one either since it was during college, but I do think this one was also around 300. So I would put this one in the A-OK category.
Okay.
The next two, LC and ST. So the first one, LC, stands for Models for Life Contingencies, which is funny because, like, again, if you were going the SOA route, you would have taken MLC. And so it was kind of like a mini MLC, if you're familiar with that. And then they had a models for stochastic processes, and that is the ST. So these were two kind of like mini exams. And when I looked back, I realized I actually took them both at the same time. In total, I studied 260 hours for both of those. So like roughly 130 for each one, to kind of give you a sense for how big they were. I had them being slightly harder than PNFM. I didn't find LC as interesting, probably because I chose to go the PNC route and just wasn't as interested in that. But I did really enjoy the stochastic processes, seeing as that's a little bit more on the statistical side. So I had that middle range, similar to MFE. So I would probably put these both in the same boat as MFE, just A-okay exams. I mean, definitely not too bad, being that they were shorter, kind of moderate interest.
Cool. That's pretty cool that you were able to study for both of those exams at the same time and combine both of those into less than 300 study hours. I think that's pretty impressive.
Well, thank you. It wouldn't have been possible if they were two larger exams. And I do know, like, I've had coworkers who have done, two of the like later big exams at the same time, and that is just mind-blowing to me. Like, I know my limits, and I definitely could not have done that, but this was definitely more reasonable. So the next one is C, which, for those who aren't familiar with that one, stands for construction and evaluation of statistical models. So I think, if anything, this is probably one that's most similar to Mass 1 and Mass 2, at least from what I could tell. I had this one as being kind of middle ground difficulty, definitely a little bit higher in terms of just like interesting material, in my opinion. And I studied about 215 hours for this one. And I think it was a 3-hour exam, if I'm not mistaken. So a little less than the recommended 300. I really liked this one a lot, and just found it really valuable. So I would probably put this up in the favorite category.
Nice. For the online courses 1 and 2, before you get into the ranking, could you just give a little bit more explanation about what these are and what they look like?
Yes, of course. So these are now replaced with something called discs, which are pretty new. But essentially they're kind of like modules or like mini tests. So they're not as full-fledged, as much content or material as like a full actuarial exam. They're kind of shorter tests, that are offered through an organization called the Institutes. And they're a little bit more insurance and like business focused. So you're not going to be getting as much like mathematical rigor in these, but it does provide some useful context for those of us that are working in the insurance environment. I don't know offhand exactly how many hours these were, but they were shorter, like maybe 1 to 2 each. Generally speaking, I think most people consider these like easy. I was someone who still needed to really study for these. It's easier in the sense that you don't need to put in as many hours as the other exams, but I still thought some of the content was like pretty challenging. Like, insurance is not a super straightforward industry, and so I definitely had to put the time in to really learn this material. So I studied about 180 hours for both of those combined. I did take them in separate sittings, I think in between the bigger exams. In terms of difficulty, I had them being a little bit more difficult than PNFM, but in terms of interest, probably like the lowest ranking one. I mean, I do love my job as an actuary, but like some of the content on those exams is it's very dry. So you kind of have to trudge through it. So I'd probably put that in like the never again category.
One of them's got to be in that category. And
Yeah.
also, just to clarify, in order to pass these online courses, did you have to get a certain score on a test or anything?
Yes. So similar to some of the early exams, they would be offered at like a Prometric center or somewhere where you could take the test online, and it would be all multiple choice, and you had to get some threshold, maybe like 70% or something like that, that had to be correct. And a lot of people that go on to get general insurance credentials like CPCU or CLU, they would also take these same exact exams in the process of getting their credentials as well. So there's some overlap there with some of the general insurance credentials. But yeah, it is just like an online multiple choice, certain hard threshold exam.
Okay, and then moving back into the exams, what did you think about exam 5?
So my ranking for this one's going to be kind of interesting because, as you know, this was the first exam I failed for the first time, but it is so like in such a strange way. Like it's an exam that's near and dear to my heart because the material is so relevant to the job that I do. And so even though I was super bummed to not pass the first time, I really chose to take it as an opportunity to learn the material even better so that I could do my job more effectively. And so for those who aren't familiar with what exam 5 covers, it's the basic rate making and estimating claim liabilities. So if you work in pricing as an actuary, this is such important content for you. And so in terms of difficulty, I had it on the higher end. Definitely not the hardest exam, but it was a step up from all the exams we had taken so far. And then I had it kind of ranked as one of my highest in terms of interest, just because it was very relevant to the work that I did. So looking at total study time, I studied roughly 300 hours for the first sitting, which, being that it's a 4-hour exam, I think, that was a little bit shy of maybe what I should have done. And then I studied 130 hours the second time around. So a total of 430. So quite a bit of time spent on that one. And I think I'd put it in the favorite category. Like, I just think, even though it was a hard experience, it was really important stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I have that same relationship with the exams I failed. I don't know if I would label them as a favorite.
Yeah. And actually my ranking for 6 is going to be very similar. So I know so many people that literally hate this exam, like more than any other one. I remember hearing horror stories about exam 6 before I got there. And so I was very motivated to pass on the first time because, one, I had just gone through, having to retake 5, but I had heard so many bad stories about how hard and boring 6 was. Well, again, for those who aren't familiar, this one focuses on regulation and financial reporting. And at least the regulation side of things, again, is so relevant to the work that I do every single day. And I actually found it so interesting to learn about the history of how insurance came to be and why it is the way it is. One of my favorite parts of my job is like dealing with all the different insurance regulators, and every single one has a different personality and like quirk to them. And it's just, you have to have that historical context and knowledge base to be able to work with them well. So I just find it a really fun challenge. And so because of that, I really enjoyed exam 6, and I was fortunate to pass it the first sitting. I did put in a ton of hours because I didn't want to retry. So I studied 375 hours for the exam, and I ranked it pretty high in difficulty, like not as hard as the upper level ones that we're about to talk about, but definitely harder than any other ones, pretty similar to exam 5. So that one's probably also going to have to go in the favorite category.
So it sounds like as you progressed through the exams, they kept getting harder. Is that correct?
In my opinion, yes. Which is going to lead us to, I can just say right now that all 3 of the rest are going to be going into the questioning my life choices. Yeah, so starting with exam 7, this one is estimating liabilities, valuation, and ERM. Now, there was just something about the upper level exams that to me just seemed like it's on a whole nother level. All actuarial exams are hard, but up to this point, like, I felt like I had a great strategy to where if I executed on that, I was able to pass. In exams 7 and 8, when I took them for the first times, I had done all the same things, put in all the hours, and came up short both times. And that was just super, super hard for me. So in terms of difficulty, I had all of these as like the highest difficulty. Interest level did range a little bit between the 3. Exam 8 is advanced rate making, which since we talked about 5 being very relevant to the work I do, this one was also probably the most relevant, getting into more complex pricing algorithms and things like that. So that one was a little more interesting. I absolutely hated exam 9. I am so unbelievably grateful I only had to take it once because I found the material so boring, so difficult to learn. And actually, I think that was the exam I studied the most for on a first sitting of any other exam. I studied 440 hours
Wow.
for that one on the first attempt. And it paid off because I passed and then I became a fellow. But that one was definitely just a really boring and hard exam, in my opinion. And that the topic of that one was financial risk and rate of return. So to other people, that might sound great. To me, that just was not something that was super interesting. And then just to kind of circle back to exam 7 and 8 in terms of study hours. So since I took both of those twice, it ended up being cumulative a lot of hours. Exam 7, I studied 280 the first time and then 330 the second time. So over 600 hours total. And then very similar for exam 8, it was about 300 and 250. It certainly pays to put the time in the first time if you can and pass, because if you have to redo it, that's a lot of your life that you're having to invest, but sometimes it happens. So yeah, those are my rankings.
Well, thank you so much. It was very interesting to hear. I'd love to hear like an overall reflection. If you could or had to do the whole exam process again to become an actuary, would you do it?
Yeah. So if I was like trying to transition careers or something like that, like right now, I think it'd be really hard to justify the investment, truthfully. I think it's a fantastic career, but I mean, I mentioned before, this took me over 7 years, and some people it takes longer. And that's just something to know going in, that like you should ideally be in it for the long haul. And if you can start like the earlier you can start, the better. I try to encourage students, like, get as many exams in as you can before you graduate. I've heard from some people like, well, you don't want too many exams because it'll be hard to find a job. No, get as many exams as you can early on in your career. My husband and I were really fortunate. He's also an actuary, and we made the decision in our marriage to wait to try to start a family until we had gotten through these exams, just knowing what a commitment they are. And so it was really a blessing to me that I had his support and that we were both on the same page from that regard. But I do not envy like mothers in particular that are trying to like continue to make progress with exams while taking care of family. Like that seems nearly impossible to me, but I know people do it. And if it's important, you can. I'm so grateful I did it and I stuck it out, because there were certainly times I wanted to give up. Definitely when I was failing 7 and 8 back to back, like that was a really hard kind of, is it worth it moment. But I'm so grateful I had people that encouraged me and helped support me so that I could keep going and keep trying. So I'm really glad I did it. Would I do it again like right now? No. But I'm glad that I did it, and I started when I did.
Do you have any exam taking tips for any younger students?
So if you want something like super detailed, I actually just launched a blog a couple months ago that walks through like every single tip I could possibly think of. So I would encourage you to check out my blog. It's called inspiringactuaries.com if you want to like get into all the nitty-gritty. But I tried to think about like high level, what were some main takeaways that I had from just the whole process in general. So I have 4 for you. The first is to always look for ways that you can apply what you're learning to the job that you're doing. Not only is that going to help you just like soak in the material and learn it more easily, but like that's the point, right? Like these exams are supposed to make us better working professionals. And if we're just learning something to memorize it and then forget it the next day, like that's kind of pointless. So highly encourage trying to look for ways to apply the material that you're learning. I also I've said this before, but just an encouragement that you can do everything right, and sometimes you're just not going to pass, and to just know that that's possible and that that's okay. And to then pick yourself back up after you've had a little bit of time off and consider, what could I do differently? and just try again. So many people that don't make it through the exam process, they just haven't persisted enough. And so a lot of the journey, not only does it take intelligence and hard work, but it takes a lot of perseverance. The next one is make sure that you celebrate the hard work that you put in and not the outcome. And it kind of just goes back to that last one of like, you can't always control how things are going to pan out. So really focus on what you can do and what you have control over, celebrate the hard work that you've put in, and just kind of trust, the outcome is what it's going to be, and control what you can control. And then the last one is, I truly would not have progressed through exams or even gotten my fellowship if I didn't have incredible support from friends, family, and coworkers. Especially with that last exam, I distinctly remember my boss at work shielding me from so many different things to help me so that I could focus in and really just knock that one out of the park. And so if you don't have a support system within your work community, be it your boss as well as your coworkers, and then people in your life, in your family that are understanding of what you're going through, it is going to make it so much harder to actually pass these things. So I think more than anything, just having a support system, people cheering you on, encouraging you, and also just helping you with practical things are kind of some of the best tips for getting through actuarial exams.
Yeah, thank you. That was some really great advice. I know that failing an exam, in my experience, is really devastating. And like you mentioned, so one of my favorite things to do is to go to my favorite cafe and get a glitter coffee where they have like gold glitter on top, and just like reward myself for trying and know that I can always like come back and try again.
I love that. That's really fun. I actually talk about in my blog how important I think it is to have like just little mini milestones along the way throughout your studying journey to kind of like keep you motivated. And whether that's like, yeah, every Friday you go get a special coffee or whatever it is that gets you excited. I think that's so important. Like you are going to have to make sacrifices to pass actuarial exams, but that doesn't mean you can't also enjoy life at the same time. Like those are not mutually exclusive.
Awesome. Those are all the questions that I have for you. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share?
I don't think so. I just really appreciate the opportunity to come on here. I hope this was helpful for people. And if anyone has questions about anything that I covered, please feel free to reach out to me. I think the majority of folks reach out through Instagram, but if you want, Bella, you can include like my email address in the comments down below so folks can connect with me. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here and to help support folks however I can.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us. It was especially helpful for me as a young exam taker. And, a lot of us try and look online for resources and exam help. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And overall, I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.